podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Helderman, and each week we're going to dive into a different piece of content, film and television, and we're going to talk with some of the biggest names in front of and behind the camera as we dive deep into how they were financed, produced, developed, marketed, and the crazy stories behind how many of them got made. Hey everybody. Today on the podcast, I'm talking with Kris Rey. Kris is a Chicago-based filmmaker, well known for working for a number of years with her ex-husband, Joe Swanberg. She was a really definitive player and producer and creator in the mumblecore movement that took off in Chicago. We're just coming off of working on a project with Kris called I Used to Go Here, which was set to premiere at the 2020 South by Southwest Film Festival, which of course got canceled due to the COVID-19 outbreak. Kris is a really talented artist, writer, and filmmaker, and also came up during the same time as people like Joe Swanberg and the Duplass brothers. Her stories are insightful and interesting. So without further ado, here's the episode with Kris Rey. Hey guys, so I've got Kris Rey on today, who BondIt just came off of working on a project called I Used to Go Here that was meant to premiere at South by Southwest before the COVID-19 outbreak. So first off, Kris, thanks for joining us and appreciate you carving out the time.
Yeah, definitely. It's easy to carve out time these days.
It is. That's sort of the first piece of feedback I think everyone gives when we start these conversations right now. So I want to start with I Used to Go Here and walking us through how that project got greenlit from early development all the way through the film now being completed.
Yeah. You want me to just go for it? Sure.
Yeah, just go for it, Kris.
I wrote it. I started writing it probably 3 or 4 years ago. I was inspired by a trip to my old university. My last feature after it played Sundance and before it came out in theaters, I had gotten invited to a bunch of different universities to show the film and talk to students. And early on, I got invited by my alma mater. I went to Southern Illinois University, and the experience of the film actually isn't based on my experience going there, because I wrote the outline for this movie on the train ride down. So on the train, it's like a 6-hour train ride. I was like, oh, this is kind of an interesting premise for a film, and started writing. And then of course, like plugged in, like kind of informed. I also went to like Indiana, and I was at MICA in Baltimore for a little bit, and just went to a few different universities, and thought it was like a really interesting dynamic, because at the time I had, a moderate amount of success, having my film just playing competition at Sundance, but certainly wasn't, a household name or anything of that level. But seeing myself through the eyes of the film students that I was talking to, I felt a little bit of like an ego inflation, because, in their mind, I had like totally made it. And I could also feel how nice that was, and how someone might want to kind of just live in that zone for as long as possible. And so anyway, I built the film around that kind of idea. And then also threw in things that I think are universal, like the idea of success, the idea of like, staying true to yourself as like an artist, and how scary that is once you do reach a certain level of success. And getting older, and being single, and all kinds of things. One thing I definitely didn't predict was this correlation that ended up happening, which is that in the film, the main character, Kate, she, everything gets sparked because she's just written a book and her book tour gets canceled. And a corollary that I didn't anticipate is that I finished this film and South by Southwest and the rest of my film festival circuit got canceled. So it ended up being really similar to my own circumstances without realizing it.
That's great. I mean, it's not great, but it's funny how life imitates art, even unintentionally and serendipitously.
Yes. Yeah. This was not something I would have wanted to happen, but yes. So yeah, I wrote the script and did, a bunch of different drafts. I think I did like 12 drafts or something. And then sent it to my agents. I'm represented at UTA. And they started setting up meetings with me with different, production companies. So I live in Chicago. I flew out to LA and met with different production companies to see if we vibed and if it was something they wanted to work on. And one of the people that I met was Becky Sloviter from Party Over Here. Party Over Here is a production company of The Lonely Island, which is Andy Samberg and Jorma Taccone and Akiva Schaffer. And I had known their work from all of their SNL skits and MacGruber and Popstar, and I like all that stuff, but I called my agent when I saw that meeting on my schedule and I was like, I don't know. They make really silly stuff and this is a comedy, but this is not like that kind of comedy. And he said, trust me, you'll love Becky. And I was like, okay, fine. So I went to the meeting and I did love Becky and she loved the script. And she told me that the guys wanted to start working on stuff that was like, had a little different than what they did. And so we ended up pairing up and that was kind of the beginning of the next phase of getting the movie together.
It's great. It's great. And so you got at that point a partner effectively in the movie.
Right.
And was the process working through the draft or was the process finding a distributor or financier? What was the next piece of going from now you've got some momentum to moving it ahead?
Yeah, I think the next piece was probably casting. And we cast Gillian. So I started meeting with actors and sending the script out and that process took a few months and then we brought Gillian on board, which was very exciting. And we were trying to find somebody to pair with her to play David. And no one seemed right because I really wanted that character that character is sort of like, the villain in a way. And he's really up to some bad stuff. He's a professor who's sleeping with one of his students. And, I started actually writing the script before the Harvey Weinstein case and before the Me Too movement. And once that came about, I was like, whoa, I'm actually, dealing with something that's like very timely and specific. And one thing that I really wanted to make sure of is that I didn't cast that character as a kind of like villainous guy. I didn't want him to seem creepy because so often I think those situations are situations that people get into with actually really nice, charming people. And it makes it more difficult. So Jermaine was perfect for me. I wanted him to be funny, attractive. It's sort of like unassuming, like not feel scary, but be a little pathetic. And also that character kind of embodies what I was talking about earlier, this idea that like if you exist in this bubble of university where you have reached a certain level of success, that having these students come in and give you adoration can be intoxicating. And I think that's what's going on with that character in the film. So so yeah, we ended up casting Jermaine, and that was like perfect for me. That's like, he's exactly who I wanted. And I actually, once I got Jermaine in my head, I could not think of any other actor that would fit the bill. So luckily that worked out. And then it was time to look for financing. So then we ended up sending out that little package to different financiers. We worked the budget. We broke the script down. We continued casting some of the smaller parts, and then we were like sending it out with UTA's indie finance division to different potential investors.
Got it. And that's how ultimately, I remember, at least the way I recall it coming to us, was that the Andy Samberg team had contacted the Jordan Levine and the Yale entertainment guys.
Yeah.
And it sort of came full circle to us at that point. And at that point, I don't know that there was a distributor on yet, because I know we've worked with Myriad, who's distributing, but I don't think they were on yet. And I think all that was being pieced together.
Right. Yeah. Definitely. That was all being pieced together at the time. Yeah.
Got it. And I'm curious, I've read and had read even before we had done this project with you, that a lot of the films you've worked on and just your style in general, utilizing improv and sort of very, very real, authentic performances for actors in the stories you tell, and certainly in your background as a filmmaker and as an artist. How hard has that been from a packaging standpoint, especially when buyers and financiers want to see everything sort of tied neatly with a bow? If you're going to experiment like that, using it more as a blank canvas as opposed to everything being so rigidly sort of perfectly fit together, did you find that at all with this in that development process? Did you find that at all in the fundraising?
In this project, no, because my first two, I came from a background that relied heavily on improv, not just dialogue, but even the entire structure of the film would be something that was improvised. And my first two features were entirely improvised, and were small enough that I worked very closely with the cast and the rest of the crew to develop the story as we went along. And after I finished my second feature, I just decided I didn't want to do that anymore. Honestly, it was like, as much as I'm very proud of that early work, the process was very stressful for me, because it takes me, I think, the process of writing a feature script or a short, it takes the writing process, I think, for me to really know what the hell I'm talking about and what story I'm trying to tell. And what I was doing earlier was sort of just relying on a premise. And then I wouldn't really understand what I was making until I went through the editing process. And often what I would learn, especially with those first two, especially with my second, is I would edit the whole movie and then I would go, shit. Now that I know what I'm doing, I wish I had filmed all this other stuff. And my second feature, I think we ended up shooting, 20 or 30 additional minutes that we tacked on at the beginning of the movie to make the thing make sense, and to say what I really wanted to say in the first place. So doing that in a draft is, I mean, that's exactly why people write scripts, right? It's to work it out and figure out what you're saying, and work it out on paper before you begin. So now that I've done that, I've made a short that way, and my last feature, Unexpected, that played at Sundance, also was scripted, and this film too was scripted. So, and to be honest, we didn't really do very much improvising in the film. There was some, but I don't think there was more than the typical comedy. But the way that that has played into my work as I see it is that I really am into naturalistic, grounded performances and dialogue. So the dialogue that I tend to write, it is very much what an actual person would say. It doesn't feel, necessarily scripted, but it is.
Right. Well, I'm curious. So bringing us back now to I Used to Go Here. So you're now out having discussions with financiers. The project now starts moving forward, gains financing. You have that package put together. At what point, and I think at that stage, then Myriad was on board. So the distributor now is at least in early discussions. Has that been consistent with the earlier projects you made? Things you mentioned, things that have premiered at Sundance, and I'm curious how that's evolved.
No, this is a very different process. With Unexpected, it was financed by some people, local company in Chicago that I knew very well on a personal basis, and then also through Chris Webber, the basketball player, the former basketball player, who also has a connection with someone that I know very well in Chicago. And so it felt very homegrown, and the investors were so hands off that it felt like, it felt like I didn't have anyone imparting anything on me at any time. And in terms of getting a distributor, we took the film to Sundance and sold it ourselves. So we didn't even have a sales agent. This was, I believe I had just signed with UTA, but wanting to try doing the sales ourselves. I was also very, very involved in that process with Unexpected, where I was, part of the decision making of like who the movie ended up going to. So it was a very different process dealing with a production company, dealing with Yale throughout the production process and into sales. Did feel different this time.
Do you think, and I know this is sort of going to tie in a couple of points, you made the comment about life sort of imitating this movie the first time around with the cancellation of the book of the main character mirrored with the cancellation of South by Southwest for this film's premiere. But then also, I believe you've had a background and a continued ongoing background in higher education. And so
right.
Seeing the world through the lens of another one of the characters and being in that world of academia. And like you said, that becomes a world unto itself where there are a variety of nuances that come along with that. How much of that, it seems like a lot of your work has been influenced by your life and like you said, naturalistic and really very grounded in reality. How much of that side of it also feels from almost like both of the main characters are pulled directly out of your own personal experiences at different times in your life?
Yep. I tend to do that. I'm not. What exactly was the question here, Matthew?
I think it's more so just understanding what does your day-to-day look like in the world of academia and how that could have influenced or did influence directly the way you've thought about this.
So in terms of, I'm a professor at Northwestern. I teach every once in a while, just one class that I teach. I would say the most I've taught is one class for 3 quarters in a row. But typically this actually didn't have, it almost had no influence on the script. Weirdly, because I am a professor there, but I really have had, for the most part, a pretty removed experience. There's a lot of protections in place. that for good reason in university life. And I haven't had any, like, I haven't really had any real personal interactions with my kids, with my students, where I've like hung out with them or gone to a party or anything that that sort of happens in the movie. And I think I had several drafts of the script written before I began teaching there. I also used to teach high school, and have been teaching for a long time. And I wish I had a better story there, but I would say it was nice to have sort of like the vibe of what a college campus is like. But I would say most of my experience that I've like led to this film had to do with me, not in a professional capacity interacting with students, like in, more of a, I guess it was sort of professional capacity, but back to when I was saying, when I was like going on tour and showing my work there.
Got it.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting and helpful from just a storyline perspective.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the Lonely Island guys and Andy Samberg and working with a more sort of infrastructured process when I used to go here. So we've done a lot with Jordan Levine and Jordan Beckerman over the years on the Yale side. We've never done anything with the Andy Samberg team. We interacted with them very, very minimally on this. Curious how your interaction was, curious what that process was like from you saying in the very beginning to UTA and, hey, I'm not sure this is the right fit, to ultimately making what we have seen to be a really quality piece of work. That I'm curious how that process evolved and how that comfort developed over time.
Once I got involved with them, I've had nothing but a great experience working with them. Becky Sloverter, who I mentioned, who was running their production company at the time, was incredible. And the movie wouldn't have gotten made without her. She was so committed. She truly loved the script. I really felt like she became a friend of mine. And she also continued to be like super professional and just really clear-headed. And, all making a movie is like encountering obstacles and, and trying to get past them. And she, every time we hit one, which was constant, I'm dealing with a hurdle right now when it comes to just like distributing the film. There's like all of these hurdles, and she was constantly like with it, like trying to figure out what the best situation was. And she was great. They helped with Yorma was sort of like my point person when it came to interacting with the guys. Akiva a little bit, but mostly Yorma, and he was really helpful from a creative standpoint. He weighed in a lot in terms of casting, and when I had often I would come to him for advice, and he was really committed to talking things over with me. He gave me some notes on the script. And then ultimately he came and played a part. He played the part of Bradley Cooper in the movie. And it was so fun. It was like such a great excuse to get him down to shoot with us. And then, I was looking forward to those guys being part of the promotion process and the press. But things are looking a little different now. But yeah, it was great to just be a part of their brand, really.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. And I'm curious, from a total 180 of having a big, what was set to be just a great premiere opportunity at South by, to now having to pivot to much more of a digital footprint on the release of this movie. How has that changed in terms of your involvement with them, but also the way you've thought through it, and then working with the distributors on, I know everyone's dealing with this in real time. Is that a super frustrating thing from a filmmaking standpoint, an artistic standpoint? Is it again, you talk about the never-ending roadblocks. I mean, this is sort of the global roadblock, and how do you sort of troubleshoot that through the lens of also wanting the film to have this life and this reaching this audience?
Yeah, I think some of it feels a little bit like being, having been pregnant for a very long time without actually giving birth. It's really strange to be going through, I have been doing a lot of interviews, and especially during the time that South by Southwest is supposed to be, doing a lot of press and podcasts and things like that. And it's so strange to, and now, now the film just got sold to Gravitas, which is great. And it's so strange to go through all of the rigmarole of the logistics of all of these things without having ever seen the film in front of an audience. And yeah, I mean, I don't know any way to describe it except for that it's strange. And I will say that in the beginning, when the festival got canceled, it felt very personal. It felt like it felt like a bad thing that was happening to me. And it also felt like a big overreaction at the time. The festival got canceled a week before it was supposed to happen. And I was so wrapped up in preparing, and I was flying my friend in to DJ for our party. And I was like, we had created a party invite. I was sending it to everybody. I was like, coordinating with my other filmmaker friend. I was like, we should wear the same outfit. I mean, some of the stuff didn't have anything to do with like the buying and selling of work. It was a celebration of this art that I had spent so many years creating. It felt like the difference between having a wedding and going in and signing your marriage certificate,
Right.
So
that's a very good analogy for it.
So it's like the movie is going to come out, and I'm very happy that's going to happen. I'm very grateful, and I feel very blessed that, a lot of people were in a situation where the pandemic struck when they were in the middle of production or right before they were about to begin. And I feel so lucky that I have a finished film. And then, of course, not very long after South by Southwest got canceled, it became clear that this was actually a really big fucking deal. And thank God they didn't have that festival, because we see the effect of Mardi Gras in New Orleans, for instance. So obviously it was certainly the right decision to cancel. And now it doesn't feel so much like something that happened to me, because countless people, almost everyone had to cancel something, a trip, an anniversary, a wedding, a funeral, like everything has been canceled for everyone. So it no longer feels like a sad personal story, but a collective sad story. So, yeah.
Totally get it. Well, shifting gears to some of the earlier days of your work and work with Joe Swanberg and the mumblecore movement and the sort of mumblecore of Chicago. So I grew up in Connecticut and was obsessed with the mumblecore movement in New York and Noah Baumbach and that sort of whole scene. It has felt like over the years, obviously, Swanberg and Duplass and all of that stuff was really, really influential to me. I mean, when I was in college, it was like my life in many ways, certainly in terms of how I thought about accessing film as this really interesting voice that felt like hadn't really been told before. It's obviously changed, right? I think mumblecore has changed, that scene has changed, but I'm curious from your days living in it, very much so, with both feet, and then seeing it evolve, the movement as a whole, how it's changed, how you think it's changed for the better, parts of it you think we're worse off for not having as much as we used to have, with buyers being really hungry for that content and audiences like being obsessed with it. I mean, I can say I've got a brother who just got out of college, and I think if I ask him who the Duplass brothers are. He probably can't identify it, but he would know pieces of their content. But the sort of direct connection to it seems to be less prevalent now than it was when I was in college. So I'm curious, take us through the days of living in that time and the evolution of that movement, and then just reflecting on it, you know, as we sort of sit here in 2020.
Yeah, I think, you know, at the time, I when I was making that work with Joe Swanberg, who's my ex-husband, you know, Joe and I went to film school together, and we graduated the same year, and both moved to Chicago and started making a film together called Kissing on the Mouth in 2004. And we had everything we needed at the time. It was very new. Digital video was very new and very exciting. And Joe's parents had bought him a PDX 150, a Sony PDX 150, which was a really nice prosumer camera, and Final Cut Pro. And at the time, it was all you needed to make a film. No films had really been made like that before, because we were used to a certain standard that couldn't be achieved by, you know, making a movie with only that equipment. And we weren't able to achieve that standard in terms of quality, but we had the freedom to make something with 4 people. We made that movie, just Joe, me, our friend Kevin Pittman, and our friend Kate Wintrick, just 4 of us. And we made it when we all had part-time jobs, when we got home at night, on the weekends. We didn't have any responsibilities except to go to our part-time jobs and make a movie together. We were all 22 years old, 23 years old. And it was really fun. And, you know, we didn't have any expectations for real success. But we wanted to, you know, we had stuff that we wanted to talk about. And we were using this new medium, which felt, you know, honestly, it was Joe's vision at the time. In the very beginning, and I thought he was crazy, you know, because I was like, no, we just graduated from film school. You have to write a script. You have to do storyboards. You have to like do all this stuff. And he was, you know, his attitude was, no, we don't. And so we didn't. And we, you know, I got him bored, and we made this movie, and it got into South by Southwest, which was the first place I had ever premiered work, and now the most recent place that I was supposed to premiere work. And the programmer at the time was a man by the name of Matt Dentler, who is now working for Apple, who was a real, you know, he basically took our movie on blind submission. And it just so happened that year, the Puffy Chair also premiered by the Duplass brothers. Andrew Bujalski's work premiered. And there was another film that was very groundbreaking at the time called Four-Eyed Monsters. And I'm blanking on the name of the filmmakers, but they were also a couple who had put themselves in the film. And all of that work had something in common. But we didn't know each other. So it was just a real, like, you know, there was something in the ether. And I think the thing that was in the ether is the ability to make films for so cheap. And the desire to do that. There was no longer that barrier to entry. But it was still so new that not everybody was doing it. And it was exciting, and it was really fun. And then, you know, Joe and I both continued to make work like that for a long time. Joe is still making work that way. I sort of evolved myself, and now I'm more interested in telling a story that as I was saying before, that comes
Sure.
that comes from a script. But I think those early kind of tenets of that still exist within me. And even while I was making this film, I was like, we could do this. We only need I remember for sure when we were doing our pickups, I was like, why do we need a full crew? Right? We can do this with 5 people. I know this. We don't need PAs. I'm just going to buy everyone Chipotle and we're going to eat it on the floor and we're going to do it. And I did buy everybody Chipotle. I think it's having that early kind of gritty, indie beginnings definitely still has an influence on the way I make work. And then, in terms of mumblecore and its relevance, of course, it's still having an influence. If it had an influence on you, it means it does trickle down to your younger brother. And I think that there's a whole generation of people that at the time were really interested in what was going on and felt very inspired by it. I know a friend of mine, Hannah Fidel, who just finished production on a series on FX called A Teacher. She credited me and my movie, It Was Great, But I Was Ready to Come Home, for her inspiration to feel like she could start making films herself. And I think seeing that people have such little resources in terms of equipment and money, and seeing that they could tell a story that could get traction was very inspiring to a lot of people. And a lot of good work came out of that. But, with anything, it snowballed. And I think, then all of a sudden it was everybody could do something. And when you have so many voices, it can become kind of overwhelming and cluttered. And, you have good quality stuff, and you also have stuff that just feels like an imitation of something else. And so the way it's sort of changed. And I think that's natural and good. It's influenced just like any kind of period in cinematic history. Its influence, I think, still remains.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting, that movement, when you think about the idea that South by Southwest had Swanberg and yourself, and then the idea that Puffy Chair would be that same year. I know we sort of always look back and reflect on these festival classes and where are those people now and what are they making now. But I agree with you on the idea that anyone can now go out and shoot something. Forget about needing a Sony camera and Final Cut, right? I mean, you can shoot something on an iPhone and cut it together on the iPhone and release it from the iPhone to a bigger audience than most people could achieve distribution, in the 90s and early 2000s. But it hasn't necessarily made the storytelling better. And I think that's what's so interesting about some of those films from mumblecore, that I think they resonate not only because people could achieve them on a shoestring, but because you could still tell a story people really responded to on a shoestring. And it wasn't the need for huge effects and huge crews and huge on-screen talent that would be the draw. The draw was, it's a really well-told piece of content. And I think there's something to sort of be said for losing a lot of that with, now there's TikTok and all these crazy, ridiculous things that they condense the viewing experience and the storytelling experience. And you would think, who are going to be the next great storytellers of this movement? And look, there certainly are, and we're certainly seeing it emerge. And it's interesting hearing your perspective being so at peace and logical about the idea of the wave just changes, and that's how it all evolves always, which I think is right. Do you think, when you say someone like Joe is still making content like that, do you think there are a lot of people able to still make content like that? Or do you think that as an artist, as you've evolved into what I would say is sort of the next phase of it, even when I look at someone like Baumbach, or even like Wes Anderson to a certain extent, with Bottle Rocket kind of being a hybrid mumblecore meeting a more traditional film, and obviously having a studio infrastructure behind that first movie, but that you've evolved, and that I feel that there's some filmmakers still doing it, but certainly fewer and farther between. But still there's an audience for it, right? There are still people that want it, for sure.
Well, I would definitely not, I would not lump in Wes Anderson or Baumbach into the mumblecore genre, because those guys were making independent films long before we were. Bottle Rocket was, one of the first. Bottle Rocket and Kicking and Screaming were some of the films that influenced me back when I was in high school. And it was, years later before I started making work or Joe started making work. So it's certainly influential, but definitely both of those films used much more traditional means of production than having, one camera and, only like, practical lights that you happen to have in your house before making and didn't use improvisation or anything like that, though they certainly did have a huge influence. But I think people's appetite changes, just like it does with anything that's popular or new. It becomes only a small amount of it can remain ultimately. It's like when something is new, everybody wants a lot of it, and it's exciting, and then you get sick of it, and some of it can remain. And I think Joe, who had a show on 3 seasons of a show on Netflix called Easy, used a lot of many of the same principles that he also used for his very first film. He also had a much higher budget level, was not using his friends anymore per se, but bringing in well-known actors. There's definitely still an appetite for that, but I think it's it's smaller than it was in 2006.
Right.
So not everybody can do it, but Joe is one of, the DeBlas brothers have changed a lot too. Their work has really evolved, and they're doing stuff that's scripted, but they're also still doing stuff that's in the same line of what they were working on with the puppy chair. So, I think that, and since that movement, if you could call it a movement, the wave is probably more likely, more descriptive. Since that wave came about, so much of the reason that it came about was because of what was available with technology. That technology has only become more accessible. So at the time, we were able to make Kissing on the Mouth because Joe's parents had the means to spend, $4,000 to give him equipment. Now, like you were saying, you only need an iPhone. But just because Tangerine came out and was shot on an iPhone doesn't mean that now everybody can only make stuff on iPhones and we're all okay with that.
Right.
It's like, it was a cool achievement, and it is available. And if someone does something new or exciting or unique with it, I think everyone is now like, yeah, that movie was made on an iPhone. Cool. That's an acceptable way to do it. I still think that people, it's not going to become the standard.
Right. No, I hear you. It's funny, the sort of few rapid fire questions I usually ask at the end here. The first one is, how have you seen the business and the process evolve since you started? And I think that's kind of been the topic we've actually talked about the entire through line of our discussion. So I don't know that we need to focus on it. I mean, I think the question I would sub in that place would be, as a woman working in this industry, with obviously a huge movement that has really been very powerful over the last several years, how much has changed, if anything? How much do you see sort of on the precipice of changing female storytellers, filmmakers, executives, perspectives, et cetera? And how has that changed over the career? Less so about craft and more so about perspective and female involvement.
Um, you know, it is tough. It's like implicit sexism still exists big time. I think there's still a systematic problem big time. I mean, we see it constantly. But I do think it has improved. And I see its improvement. It's been hard to tell, because as you know, as things have been changing, I think for the benefit of female filmmakers in the last 5 to 10 years, I also have naturally sort of like grown as a filmmaker myself. So I think often when I get more opportunities, it's hard to know if it's because things are changing for the better for all women, or if it's just, you know, that my career is growing on an individual level. But I do think people are interested much more now than they have been in the female voices. And I see that not just from a standpoint of a writer director, but I see that when I go in and meet with executives. When I first started the rounds in LA, meeting with different production companies, et cetera, I had this thing in my mind that I was going to go be meeting with a bunch of, like, you know, middle-aged white guys. And I was like, all right, here I go. And then it was surprising to me that I ended up meeting a lot of really cool women that were my age, often younger, that were really energized, that were, you know, had had an important position in their company and the ability to make choices. And I thought it was, you know, that was really surprising to me, obviously, in a positive way. And I'm continuing to see that a lot of people are putting a lot more weight on the female perspective, and I think it's great. There's still a long way to go, but I'm certainly seeing change for the better in that realm.
It's great. The last question I have is, you're obviously in Chicago. You've spent the majority of your career and building your career in Chicago, at least as home base. For people outside of LA, outside of New York, thoughts, guidance, perspective, especially as people go about thinking how to access making their own work, accessing the business of entertainment. How important is LA and New York, if at all, and your experience?
I think it's super important. I think living in LA, living in New York can be very helpful. If you're interested in going the route of making independent work, I think you can do that anywhere. And I do think that there is sometimes an advantage to not being in New York and LA when you're first starting out, because you have resources that are, it's difficult to make an independent film in a city that is an industry town, because there's protocols and people are used to it. I mean, it's like, you know, going to a cafe in Silver Lake and saying like, hey, do you mind if I just, could I, you know, whatever. They're like, give me a fucking break. No. Yeah. But going to a cafe here in Chicago, or if you're in, you know, Kansas City or in, you know, Delaware or whatever, you can probably find people that are willing to just do it for fun.
Right.
And it, like we've been saying, equipment should not be a barrier. There's no shortage of information on the internet of basically how to create your own film school. And I do think that there can be something interesting for Hollywood to say like, oh, look at this interesting thing that's going on in Baltimore, Maryland. There's wow, this young filmmaker from Baltimore, Maryland, like just made this like really cool independent film, versus like, oh, there's just another kid in LA who's like trying to do something. So I think I still feel some positives from being out of town. Right now during the pandemic, it doesn't matter where the hell you are. Everybody is Skyping right. and doing stuff like that. In normal times, if that ever, or I'll say in the before times, I did find that I had to go out to LA quite a bit to meet with actors, to meet with my agents, to meet with different production companies, and to take meetings. But I didn't feel the need to do that until I was well into my career. So I teach a class. The class I teach at Northwestern it's a web series class, and the philosophy behind it is that that they should just like run and gun and make it without a script and quickly throw it together and see what they can do. And in the time of a quarter, they have to come into the class not having any idea what they're going to make. To 10 weeks later, they have 3 episodes of a web series. And it's really cool. They make really good stuff. And they learn to do it in a really bootstrappy, quick way that I think lends itself really well to making independent work. And that's, of course, as I've been talking to you about, how I began. And I always encourage those students to stay in Chicago if they're thinking about if they want to become filmmakers, if they're thinking about making their work, because you have a tight community of kids, not always kids, but you have a tight community of students who already know each other, who know how to work together, and who can live fairly cheaply while they do it. Right. The rent in LA is crazy. The rent in New York is even worse. And, you can live in Chicago without a car, and run and gun and make something, that you're proud of and try and get it out there. And I think that's a really valid way to go about it.
I appreciate it. No, it's funny. I agree with everything you just said. And usually the last question we sort of leave it with is, if you're giving guidance or a piece of, imparting wisdom on what young people should do when they're thinking about going out to start a career. And I agree with you. In college, I scraped some money together, shot a feature that is just terrible. Looking at it 10 years later.
That's great.
But used it as sort of this launch pad to come to LA and take meetings and ultimately sell the film to a very shitty distributor and sort of learn the business through the lens of like, okay, there's this huge machine of an industry that is out there. So totally agree with you. The last thing I'd leave with would then just be, so I used to go here coming out from Gravitas, any details where people can find it, where people should look for it, how people should think about accessing it?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I know, and then we'll see if it comes true.
Yeah.
What I know now is that they're wanting to release it August 7th. If theaters exist, it'll be in some theaters. If they don't, then it'll be on iTunes and Amazon for purchase. And then it'll be on HBO December 18th.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's great. Well, Kris, it was really, really lovely chatting with you. Thanks for carving out the time while we're all locked in. And I don't know if there's anything else, but that's all from my side. So appreciate that.
Yeah, it's great. Afternoon. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for being a part of getting the movie made.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kris. We'll talk soon.
All right, bye.
Thank you all for listening to another episode of Greenlit, the Buffalo 8 podcast. For financing questions, feel free to contact us at BondIt Media Capital at info@bondit.us. For production, development, and distribution questions, feel free to contact us at Buffalo 8, info@buffalo8.com. We'd love to hear from you and hope you'll continue listening to the podcast episodes ahead.